Now towards the end of this video, I'm going to show you an unequivocally unique piece of land. In fact, in all the years I've been making these films, it's the single most bizarre piece of land I've ever come across. Okay, sneak preview, here is a view from above. Now to you and I, that looks probably quite normal for Wiltshire and the south of England, but can you see the bit that I'm referring to? Now in order to get to that bit of land, well, we do need to trespass. We will show you it shortly, but it's worth noting in the meantime that when we make such videos where there's a trespass issue or a blocked pathway, a blocked right of way, an access island, misleading signs, anything at all like that, especially the right to roam, well, we get a lot of questions, genuine questions, and perhaps some misunderstandings.
Hi, my name's Jon Moses. I'm currently the co-director of the Right to Roam campaign. Used to be an academic and an educator, and now I'm pretty much a full-time access campaigner.
So I thought it'd be quite useful to speak to someone that can answer all of these questions and a lot more eloquently than I ever knew how to.
So since I've been campaigning, every day looks completely different. I might be organising a resistance to a kind of back row enclosure like at Cirencester Park recently. I might be writing op-eds for journalists. I might be doing interviews like this. I might be writing kind of detailed policy positions and probably learning a lot more about dogs and dog feces than I would like to.
And one of the questions we get asked a lot is, what about the environment? In particular, what about ground nesting birds? If people have access to land far greater than they do now, well, how's that going to affect the environment?
A lot of the landscapes that ground nesting birds thrive in are also the ones at the moment where we already have access. So the question is really, how do we alleviate pressure necessarily on those ground nesting birds? As I said, I'm kind of open to there being exclusion during nesting season, particularly for kind of scheduled species that are really at risk. But most of the time, the kind of disturbance to ground nesting birds, it's not coming from humans accessing the landscape. Because of the way we move, we tend to kind of stick to particular paths. If you give people a good path that takes them to where they want to go, that's the line that we'll follow. The issue really with ground nesting birds comes from dogs, and that's why we do need to see some dog reform in this country. We do need regulation and education.
One of the biggest queries we get asked is, well, what does the right to roam mean? Does that mean that people are just going to turn up in my back garden?
So we get this question all the time. There is no right to roam law in the world that allows people to roam in anyone's back garden. Every right to roam legislation, Sweden, Scandinavia, Central Europe, wherever, protects domestic privacy, protects the curtilage of the house, it protects the kind of the garden area. So your privacy will not be infringed. I have to say, if you do want to come and roam in my back garden, that's absolutely fine. Let me know in advance. I'll put the kettle on. We'll have some cake. We'll have a nice chat. Like I don't personally see it as a great issue. People want to come and hang out in my back garden. I think it's quite nice, but the right to roam won't change anything to do with that.
Surely that person owns that piece of land. It's theirs to do what they want, and you shouldn't be on it. It sounds a bit entitled of you to think that you should be able to go on it. So we put that to Jon.
So I always find this argument quite interesting, because actually we think about the etymology of entitled. It means to have title to, it means to own land essentially. And because of our history in the UK, land ownership is astonishingly unequal. So 1%, less than 1% actually, of the population of England own more than 50% of the land, and a large proportion of that is actually an aristocracy that's owned the land basically back to the Norman conquest. So should it really be the case that our access to nature is being determined by people whose kind of distant descendant was very good at being a feudal warlord and kind of massacring a load of people and kind of colonising a place? I don't think in a democratic society that's a sensible way to understand what access should be about. This country is our kind of common inheritance. Yes, we should be protecting people's livelihoods. No, people shouldn't have the right to go literally everywhere. But unless there's a kind of good justification for keeping people off the land, and I think this is all of our country. We should be able to know it, and we should be able to love it.
Will the right to roam cause an obvious conflict with nature?
One of the criticisms of the Right to Roam campaign is, that we need to make space for nature. And, I'm not against excluding land for access when it's for conservation purposes. And actually, if we create more access land, we can be a bit more targeted about where exclusions ought to apply. But at the moment, what's happened, because we have such a tiny amount of access land, 8%, basically humans have been squashed into the same places as nature. So over 50% of access land is also on sites designated for nature protection. So at the moment, all the kind of nature and all the people is being kind of like squashed together in one place. And actually, we had a more open and comprehensive model, then it would relieve some of that pressure. It is worth saying, however, that actually people aren't always a threat to the natural world. And when Natural England surveyed what happened with conservation and the kind of ecological impacts after they passed the Crow Act in 2000, they found that actually it hadn't really made much difference that there were people around. There was a slight caveat to that, which that dogs can cause some localised disturbance and some issues. And so we're working on that area as a campaign as well. Access rights may not apply to dogs in the same way, and there needs to be reform there. But overall, sometimes we, I think, overstate the danger that humans pose to the natural world. We need to bring people into the landscape, give them a kind of deep, meaningful sense of connection to place in order to become advocates and guardians for the natural world. And for us in the Right to Roam campaign, that's really what this is about long term. Yes, access to land is great for our kind of physical and mental health. It's good for recreation and all that side of it, but it's also long term about deeper connections with the landscape and with the natural world, so that we can be kind of entwined with nature and become sort of a part of it and act to protect it too.
If all of a sudden you have a newfound freedom and you can walk wherever you can with respect because of the right to roam, does that mean that the place is going to be littered thereafter?
So yeah, every time we have this discussion, someone will pipe up and say, yes, well, we've heard about your rights, but what about responsibilities? And in a way, I completely agree, but let's take responsibility more seriously. Responsibility, the word derives from response. So you have to give people access in order to give them something to respond to and to create a culture of responsibility as well. And I think when we talk about responsibility, we're often framing it in a kind of negative way, right? That it's like, people need to, they're just going to cause damage and need to be picking up their litter and that kind of side of it. And yeah, all those things are true, but actually responsibility has a really positive element to it as well. And in a way, what we're calling for is a right to be responsible, a right to bring people into the land in order to nurture it, in order to protect it, in order to form kind of deeper ecological relationships, to be the agents of kind of ecological restoration and change. We've actually seen in the last decade, kind of real resurgence of interest in citizen science, in local people kind of helping plant trees and support ecological renewal. And so we've actually just gathered loads of those cases in this book called Wild Service, Why Nature Needs You. And really this is a book about responsibility, but in the deeper sense. It's about giving everyone the chance to care and protect for the natural world, because actually that's as enriching and as important as the right to access it.
So if we do have a right to roam in this country one day, well, how will that look with regards to dogs and dog walkers? Because that's one of the biggest concerns of you guys in the comments section.
Most people, most dog owners want to do the right thing, but very, very few people have heard of a ground nesting bird, know where it nests, know what time of year that it nests. So we need to kind of bring that education and distribute it in a kind of much more kind of systematic way. And at the moment, there's just no kind of advice, assistance, education, or really kind of regulation around dogs and around dog ownership. And that's what we need to address if we're going to make sure that ground nesting birds thrive. But really, disturbance even from dogs is pretty low down the threats that those species are facing. Mostly it's to do with habitat loss and habitat destruction. And in the end, the only people that can resist that and fight for it, fight against habitat loss, are the people that love landscapes. And so you need to bring people in to make them its protectors.
And then of course there's the issue of liability, as many of you rightly point out. What does this mean for landowners and farmers if all of a sudden you can walk along the side of a field you couldn't do before, you trip, you maybe sprain or break an ankle? Are you going to start suing the farmer or the landowner?
So most people actually misunderstand liability law. So there's an assumption actually that you kind of fall over and twist your ankle on a field or something, that the landowner is going to be automatically liable for that. That's not the case. Generally with liability law, the landowner has to tell you about kind of unreasonable and unpredictable hazards. So for instance, if there was a covered mine shaft, yes, you would have to kind of sign that and section it off, because I couldn't reasonably anticipate that mine shaft is there. But if a tree falls on me, and actually all the case law supports this while I'm walking along land, then actually kind of that's my problem, because if I'm walking through a wood, I could anticipate that falling trees might be an issue. So firstly, there is a misunderstanding about liability law and how it applies to people carrying out reasonable activities. I do think, however, because this misconception exists, that actually we should clarify liability law, and maybe we should reduce some of the liability burden that landowners face. I personally feel that if I'm on land, I'm there at my own responsibility. It's up to me to keep myself safe and make sensible decisions, and I don't think it's reasonable that we would go and therefore kind of sue a landowner because something bad happens to me, say if I'm rock climbing or something like that, and I managed to cock it up and fall over and break my leg. I don't think that should be the landowner's fault. As I said, existing liability law would probably protect the landowner in that instance, but it's commonly misunderstood. It's a source of fear and anxiety, understandably, for landowners, and sometimes for their insurers as well. The insurers don't understand the law. So I think we do need to clear that up, and I think that would be part of any access reform that we have.
So I alluded at the start of the video to a bizarre and unequivocally unique piece of land where we got to by means of trespassing. Well, turns out you've been looking at it the whole video. Yep, this entire interview was conducted on what's referred to as an access island, completely legal to explore, however completely illegal to get to. Wiltshire alone has over 500 acres of such pockets of land. Why is this one unique? Well, it's tiny and over half a kilometre from the nearest right of way. Too bizarre. And there it is, one of the most bizarre pieces of open access land you can't legally access.
So basically, in the year 2000, the Countryside and Rights of Way Act was passed, and that's what's given us 8% of England, giving kind of roaming rights to 8% of England. And it was allocated by land use and land designation, so it applied to mountain, moor, heath, down, and some common land as well. The problem was that because it used land designation as its basis, it's created all these kind of odd phenomena. So right now we're standing on an access island, a tiny little fragment of land where technically we have the right to roam, but there's no actual lawful way of getting here. And that's because the land use here, this was unimproved downland. It hasn't been grazed or ploughed up before. It hasn't been kind of altered in any way. And so that became a form of access designation, and you could roam, but actually all the land around it did get changed and altered. And so we've got over 2,500 of these kind of access islands around the country now. And I think, some of these are beautiful and places that we would want to be, but I think really more than that, what it shows us is actually some of the flaws of taking that approach to access. And so as a campaign now, rather than extending kind of access rights to kind of new land designations that can be disputed in the courts and involve all these really kind of complicated, expensive mapping exercises to work out where they should fall, instead we should follow the model that Scotland has used and Scandinavia has used, which is creating a kind of default right of responsible access to land and water, and then working backwards to think about where the sensible exceptions might be. So at the moment, anytime we step off a right of way or leave access land, we are technically trespassing. And what that's basically done is empower people to feel extraordinarily angry actually when someone not causing any harm simply wanders off the path or makes a mistake or something like that. And so we're already starting from a position of confrontation and antagonism, whereas actually in Scotland, the idea is that it's a right of responsible access, and the Scottish Outdoor Access Code sets this kind of mutual contract. So we kind of meet each other as landowner and as access user from a place of kind of mutual respect and kind of negotiating our shared interests. And I think that's much more healthy culturally than what we have now, where it's like, if I step off the path for 1 minute, it's almost like an infringement or an attack on that person, and they become very defensive and angry, and that creates a very kind of sour relationship. Yeah, quite kind of abrasive, dividing line that's really kind of necessary, I think, in most instances. Yes, we should be protecting people's domestic privacy, but actually our starting point when we meet people in the landscape shouldn't be one of confrontation and antagonism. It should be about finding those kind of mutual interests and mutual respect.
Huge thanks to Jon Moses and the Right to Roam campaign. We'll put all the juicy links in the description below. If you want to see some really crazy examples, not just that little triangle of the open access islands, you need to go and click on that video just there.